All right. Howdy, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk and missing out on your chance to see Dylan talk. So, appreciate it. My name's Arthur Doler, or Art. I have my social details, although nowadays we have these two, so I got to figure out a way to fit that in the template. But you can also find the slides for this talk at that bit.ly. If you don't catch it now, it'll be again at the end of the talk, and then I'll tweet it out afterwards, so you'll have a chance to catch it. But today, we are going to talk about owning your experience at work. I work at a small software consultancy in Omaha, Nebraska in the United States. They're nice enough to let me come do things like this, so they get a slide in the talk. But I guess let me introduce myself properly. Hi, my name is Art, and I'm a crazy person. And I use that word, crazy, very specifically because we have a lack of good words to talk about the things that are going on in our heads and in other people's heads. And we think that we are separate from our own emotions. And we think that we're in total control of our own thoughts. And I'm here to tell you today that we are absolutely not. So, over the course of this hour, we're going to talk about how your experiences affect you. And then we're going to talk about me for about 15 minutes in the middle of the presentation, because it's my presentation and you can't stop me. Then we're going to talk about why you should be talking about your mental health at work. And then we're going to talk about how to talk about it. And lastly, we're going to talk about overcoming roadblocks to doing that. So, before that, I have to say, the situations here are hypothetical. The advice here is representative. Every situation is different, so please don't assume that this advice is correct. I am not a psychologist, I am not a therapist, I am not a psychiatrist, okay? I'm not a doctor in any shape or form. I am an engineer, software engineer, like most of you, I'm assuming. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about the world, your brain, and you. So, I don't think it's a stretch to say we can't control what happens to us. I mean, the last couple of years have taught us that, if nothing else, right? We are largely, the world is out of our control because causality is very complex and things just happen and we don't even necessarily understand why. We also tend to think that the things that happen don't affect us, but they do. And that's not really a stretch to believe that the things that are going on in the world, like a global pandemic, could affect us. We also believe that we are in charge of our own thoughts. But in general, we can't control them. They just kind of happen to us. In fact, we're so bad as a species at controlling our own thoughts that there's a psychological paper that I read, and this is the title. It's not, hey, can we control our own thoughts? It's, measuring thought control failure, sensory mechanisms and individual differences. We're so bad at controlling our own thoughts that the paper's just like, we're not even going to talk about how good we are. How bad are we at this? And of course, the absolute conclusion of that talk is we found that the average thought control index score was not significantly above 0. We as humans aren't really good at controlling our thoughts, at having thoughts that we actually intend to have. Thoughts happen to us, and we tend to believe and run with those thoughts whenever they happen. There are whole schools of therapeutic techniques that are kind of based around this, things like CBT or mindfulness, that are based around going, well, maybe you don't have to believe every stupid thing your brain thinks. And your emotions affect how you think, like cognitively affect how you think. You can kind of think of the brain as two concurrent running systems, cognitive and affective. Now, these aren't like physically located in your brain, but you can think of them like processes that are constantly running. And the cognitive process works about like you would expect. It's the logical, linear, rational process. On the other hand, there's the affective process. And the affective process's job is basically to sort your entire world into two buckets, good things and bad things. And as it turns out, if you experience something that your brain sorts into the bad bucket, if I turn around and I put a little timer on a site that says 7 people already have this in their cart and you have 5 minutes left to get this at the 30% off sale price, I am trying to make you stupid because I'm trying to make you anxious. And being anxious actually makes you less smart. It dampens your cognitive abilities. That's what's going on when people do what they call these anti-patterns of UX. Conversely, though, if I make you feel like you are smart, if I make you feel like you are valued, you actually think better. You perform better at cognitive tasks. So, okay, emotions affect you, but it sounds like talking about them is just awful and we don't want to do it. Well, part of that is because we don't have good language for it, or we don't use good language for it. So let me provide you a couple of examples of two different kinds of language that we can use. So we're going to talk about who is art. I need notes for this, sorry. Art was born into a family with a history of undiagnosed mental illness, including ADHD, depression, anxiety, and potentially bipolar II. His initial symptoms manifested as acting out during early childhood, which was possibly disguised by the non-standard learning environment in which he found himself. He developed a resistance to authority, actively masked by socially normative behavior whenever he was in public settings or when he was being explicitly evaluated. His impulsive actions often resulted in significant tensions with teachers and within his family. Initial attempts at diagnosis were ineffective due to significant lack of engagement and non-compliance with the procedure. As a result, his family cohesion suffered greatly. Art experienced delayed entry into the public school system due to the non-standard learning environment in which he found himself previously. And his inability to control his impulsive behaviors led to a general social isolation from his peer group. His failure of executive functions led to an inability to satisfactorily complete schoolwork. Peer isolation led to a general reaction formation in favor of self-isolation and a prolonged depressive episode. In addition, a fixed mindset arising from praise during his developmental periods led to actively refusing challenging work. Art finally sought therapy and was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and depression. He began a medication regime subject to frequent alterations, which proved to have beneficial effects on his schoolwork. On the other hand, previous behavioral and communication patterns within his family persisted, resulting in continuing deterioration of that situation. As a result, Art voluntarily relocated himself to his relatives' homes during his senior year of high school. His social skills began to normalize during that time, however, and college provided an unique opportunity to redevelop his persona in the absence of familiar persons or environs. On the other hand, eventual medication noncompliance led to a resurgence of ADHD symptoms with predictable decline in academic ability. He developed personal coping strategies, including significant, usually involving artificially inflating stress through significant self-imposed deadlines or negative self-talk. He also began significantly abusing caffeine. He had moderate success at managing his ADHD symptoms and ended up graduating and taking a job, eventually, which had significant external and systemic stressors. At this point, he began experiencing panic attacks and stereotypical aversive behavior. He re-entered treatment and was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. He engaged in a year of therapy before embarking on a course of medication. He's been 100% medication compliant for 9 years now, and his symptoms are 98% managed. So that was Art. But who am I? I always knew that I was different from other kids. I could feel it. Like there was something that I couldn't sense that everyone else was easily able to see. I didn't understand why I would do things sometimes. Thoughts would leap into my head and I would immediately act on them. And my parents or teachers would ask, "Why did you do that?" I would reply, "Honestly, I don't know." And they didn't like that answer. And so I learned not to trust them. I thought, actually, for a long time when I was a kid, that I was actually an alien, that I had had some weird Superman scenario where my parents had crash landed on this planet and I'd been adopted by my well-meaning but ultimately incompetent human parents. And that was the reason why I felt so different, so alone from everyone else. I didn't really understand. And my parents tried to put me into therapy, tried to get me diagnosed, and they put me in with a therapist who asked me questions. And I understood, I knew how good boys were supposed to act. And I could hold it together for about 45 minutes, the length of a session. So I did. I lied to him. Now, to be fair, if you're a therapist and you let an 8-year-old buffalo you, that is kind of on you. But he blamed my parents for most of it. I'm sure you can imagine how well that went. And so things persisted. Things continued to get worse. My family had a history of these things, these experiences, and they didn't play well together. And then we hit middle school. I went to a Montessori school for my elementary area, which went through 6th grade. And in the US, where I went to school, we had middle school, which is 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And so, 7th grade, I joined middle school, which was a lot like parachuting into a no man's land in World War I. All of the camps had already been formed. Everyone already had their friends, their cliques, and they knew exactly where they fit in the social structure. And I absolutely did not. And I was pretty bad at it besides. Now, let me tell you, if you ever find yourself in that situation, barking at people in the hallways just doesn't help. Scratch that one off the list right away. But I didn't understand, again, what I was doing in that situation. I wasn't good at social things. My schoolwork, the difference between Montessori and the education system, the public education system, was so vast that I found myself lost. And I turned around and had another moment, a story that I started telling myself, that of course, everyone doesn't understand me because I'm such a misunderstood genius. Clearly, they're all jealous of my brilliant intellect. Totally not true. Absolutely not a genius. But it's, again, a story I was telling myself to explain why, again, I found myself alone. And after a while, I realized I just couldn't take it anymore, and I went back to my parents and I said, hey, can we try this therapy thing again? And I went back to the therapist, and this time I bought in. I told them what was happening, I told them what was going on in my head, and I got my diagnoses. I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and with depression, although if you can find a child of that age that is not diagnosable with depression, they deserve a medal. And I started going on drugs. They put me on these Dexedrine, which is used to give to combat pilots back in Vietnam, which is a strange thing to give a 15-year-old, but it actually worked. And I started having the ability to do schoolwork, and I started actually kind of understanding a little more. And then high school happened, rather. And high school let me explore, but the thing that really let me explore was the internet happened. And the early internet I miss dearly, because it is this place that you could just put on different identities and go pretend to be people, and that was okay. That was a thing everybody did at the time. And it let me explore and go, oh, let's play with these people and see how they interact. Oh, that didn't go well. Well, I'll come back tomorrow as somebody else and try again. And I actually used that to my great advantage to basically learn how to be a human. But despite all of these things, despite the advances I was making elsewhere, I'd been living with my family so long that all of these patterns just existed. I knew exactly how to piss my father off. It was almost like working a vending machine. Just like, oh yeah, put in that, you hit these buttons, and then that, and out comes an extremely angry dad. Why did I do that? I don't know. So when my psychologist said, hey, you know what, you need to get out of there, I said, you're damn right I do. And I went and lived first with my grandparents and then with my uncle until I went off to college. And college was fantastic. College was great. This place where you could explore and play. And I didn't know any of the people there, so I got to make new friends, and they didn't know how awkward I used to be, or, still was, or they could at least pretend to ignore it. And then, because we all do stupid stuff in college, I went off my meds. I didn't start drinking, I just went off my meds instead. And I had to learn how to deal with that. I had to learn how to yell at myself to get something done. I had to learn how to tell myself that it was due like 2 weeks in advance so that I would actually finish it. But, it wasn't exactly great. I graduated. I'm not going to tell you what my GPA was, but I did graduate. And I somehow found myself in a job doing software. And I kept doing software. I kept learning, I kept growing. Things were all right until I took a job for a company that does voting systems in the United States. Now, this was before 2020, but it was still very stressful. because I'm, a huge nerd. I'm a bit of a politics wonk. And I really cared a lot about that job. And that job did not care back at all. And so I found myself in my car outside work, not sure if I could actually open the door and get up and go into my desk that day. Now, I'm not a genius, but I am smart enough to know that that's not right. So I went back to therapy. I went back and talked to somebody for a year before he said, you know what, you should probably try getting on drugs again and see if it stabilizes you. And I said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So I did. And that first day back on those drugs, how many of you have ever seen A Beautiful Mind, the movie? Okay, a couple of people. There's these scenes where he's looking and you just see like math equations floating by. There's memes based on this. I'm sure you've seen some of the GIFs or GIFs, depending on which camp you're in. I don't want to piss anybody off. But it was kind of like that being back on the drugs. Like I could just see things suddenly. I could just do things. I could just pick up the phone and call somebody. I didn't have to do this weird like dance where I picked up the phone and dialed a number and then put down the phone and then eventually sometime I'd pick it up and hit the call thing before my anxiety realized what was going on and stopped me. And now it's real angry because I'm on the phone with somebody. I could just pick up the phone and call them. I didn't have to have that weird dance. And I started exploring mindfulness meditation as a tool to help me grow, as a tool to help me explore myself and augment the things that I was learning. I found my road to recovery, and I've been walking that road ever since. It hasn't always been easy, and there have been potholes and bumps in the road, and sometimes I go off over here for a while into the thicket, but I always get back on it. So, what was different between those two stories? It wasn't just the pronouns. The first story was told in using what's called clinical language, and the second story is in what I call experiential language. Clinical language is the language of the psychiatrist. It is focused on the diagnosis. It is deficits-based. It constrains and it confines an individual. And it is by its very nature motionless. Experiential language, on the other hand, is the language of the person. It focuses on what happens to an individual. And it describes and it delineates that individual's experience. It's based on their personal truth, and it is by definition emotional. Clinical language is the difference between clinical language and experiential language is the difference between this conversation and this conversation. There's a world between those two. And clinical language saps the power out of an individual. It is based on passivity. Experiential is based on self-direction and self-responsibility. Clinical language has what's called an external locus of control, which is to say it's talking about things that are happening to a person. There is no agency. There is no sense of control for that person. Whereas experiential language has an internal locus of control. It's about what that person is doing, what they're experiencing, what their actions are, and their subjective world. Well, we are engineers, though. So you might ask, well, isn't clinical language the technical terminology that we should be using? Well, sort of. In the United States, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, edition 5, as the basis for what we call a mental health diagnosis or a mental illness. It's basically the big book of ways your brain breaks. Anybody read it? It's a page turner. Yeah. I actually have. It's full of stuff like this. These are some of the criteria for one of my diagnoses, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The DSM-5 and all of the other manuals that people use to diagnose you with a mental condition are basically checklists. When you are speaking with somebody who is going to diagnose you, they're running down a checklist and going, yep, you meet that criteria. Oh, you have 7 of 9 out of these. Congratulations, here's your diagnosis. It's more or less bird watching. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not saying that it isn't useful. But the problem is that we are trying to wrap our brains around an incredibly complex system. We're trying to basically make a system describe itself. The brain is the most complex system that we have ever encountered, and we only have the same brain trying to understand it. The big wet hunk of meat between your ears. And we're trying to grasp it and going, okay, well, this thing is kind of like this other thing, so we're putting those in this bucket, and this thing and that thing. But when you actually talk about the experiences that people have, they can be quite different from each other, even if they have the same diagnosis. Again, I'm not saying the diagnosis is completely useless, but what I'm saying is it is not very precise. And that, in fact, cultural norms can affect what is even considered to be a diagnosis. Being gay was a diagnosis in earlier editions of the DSM. And additionally, your diagnosis can be affected, or whether you get a diagnosis or not, can be affected by the duration or the intensity of the symptoms you're describing to that person. And it's based on their perception of those particular variables. And on top of all of that, there are things that we classify as mental illness that are part of the normal human experience. Being anxious, being depressed are normal to some extent. When does it cross that line? It's up to the person diagnosing you. What I want you to take away from this, and how I want you to think about these diagnoses, is that they are not prescriptive, they are descriptive. They are attempting to describe a human experience. They are not something like the flu, where you get it and these are the course of symptoms you are going to work through. They're these buckets that we have lumped things together and say, this often happens with this. And the reason that matters is because when you are talking to an individual, if you start to classify them based on diagnosis, you can be doing them a huge disservice because their experience can be different. I talk with other folks on Twitter who have ADHD or diagnosed with ADHD, and they have very different experiences from me sometimes, like drastically so. So when we're talking experientially, a diagnosis becomes less useful. I prefer to think of it as lived experience, how you live in the world, how you exist in the world. Okay, so why does talking about it matter so much? Let's make the case for why you should be talking about it. For starters, everybody's experience is different. And you are the only person who can advocate for your own experience. If you are not out there advocating for what you need to be successful, you are actively hampering yourself. And you won't be successful. On top of that, if you share with others, if you are vulnerable with others, it actually increases cohesion in a team, for instance. Vulnerability often prompts vulnerability rather than prompting derision. And you need cohesion. You need relationships with others to be successful. On top of all of that, if you recognize when something is happening to you and understand it as an affective experience, as an emotional experience, then you can start to plan for it, regardless of if it's diagnosable or not. Because that's the magic of language that is experiential, is suddenly the diagnosis just kind of goes away. And now you're just describing, this is how it feels to be me. And that language works regardless of what your experience is. I have a cat that we discovered has cancer, liver cancer, and we discovered that in December. Not doing great about it, frankly. But I can talk with my coworkers about that experientially. And it doesn't matter that I'm talking about a cat versus talking about, one of my family having cancer or something that's going, and if I just can't get out of bed that day. We can talk about it using the same language, and it all has the same value. This language is just as useful for describing something that is happening to you as something that is happening in your head. And again, if you use that, you can plan for it. And on top of that, you, again, have to be your own advocate. There's a thing called the fundamental attribution error where we tend to make up stories about other people. I had a coworker once who used to fall asleep at his desk. And I don't mean like falling like this, just head back snoring. We made fun of him because who does that? But none of us ever asked the guy, hey, is something wrong? Is there some way I can help? We just leapt to the conclusion that I think Diablo 3 had just come out. He was obviously up late playing Diablo 3 all night and just came into work completely just on 2 hours of sleep. Nobody ever asked. Nobody ever verified that that was true. Any number of things could have been possible. If you're not out there providing the story for you, then somebody else is making up a story that is almost guaranteed to be worse. So what keeps us from talking about this? Why can't we have these conversations? Well, we have a lack of good language. We have fear, we have shame, and we have something I'll call facile optimism. So let's talk about each of those in turn, starting with language and how to talk about your experience. So to do that, we need a little help, because sometimes we're engineers, we don't always do so good at the people stuff, because we don't want to blunder into this conversation. I'm sorry if your name's Steve, by the way. So let's talk with Jordan and Taylor, all right? We're gonna go through some scenarios here and look at how Jordan and Taylor interact. Now, throughout these scenarios, I want you to hold this rule in mind. You can't solve or fix anything in these conversations about people's experiences. That's because there is nothing to fix or solve. You are not going to make somebody who is experiencing depression suddenly magically happier by telling them that they should smile more. And if you do that, they might stab you and you will actually deserve it. Okay? I guarantee you they've heard it all before. They probably thought it all before. So just keep that in mind. You're not here to fix them. So conversation type 1A, Jordan asking Taylor for future support. Now, we have an asking script because, again, sometimes we just need a little help. So let's go through some examples of what this looks like. Here's the script. I could really use some support. Could you insert helpful action here? Or I don't know if you knew this, but I deal with or I'm having problems with this specific kind of experience. You've been helpful to me in the past. Would it be okay in the future if you do this actionable thing when an event happens? So for instance, Jordan could say, hey, I've been having a tough time with my mood lately. If you see me starting to isolate myself, could you just take me out for a cup of coffee, please? Now, ideally in this situation, Jordan is going to be clear and direct in what they're asking Taylor to do and when they're asking Taylor to do it. And ideally, Taylor isn't going to problem solve. Remember rule 0. We're often, if we're engineers, we want to leap straight to like, oh, have you tried this? Have you thought about this? You want to solve the problem for them. You have to resist that urge. And also, ideally, Taylor is not going to promise anything that they're uncomfortable doing. If you promise support to somebody in the future, and the time comes and you're not ready or comfortable providing that support, that is way worse than just saying no up front. Conversation type 2B is Jordan, in a critical moment, asks Taylor for support. Okay, I've just used a phrase, so let's stop and talk about what I call critical moments. I call a critical moment a moment when your normal coping strategies no longer work. When whatever is happening to you or in you is overwhelming everything that you have built up to help you get through the day. And that can be true whether you have a diagnosis or not. Something is just washing over you tidal wave-wise. Frank Britt has a book about, or she talks about mental indigestion, where it's something too much, too soon, or too often. And that's how I like to think about these things. But in those moments, we unfortunately have to talk about the big S word, suicide. And we have to talk about safety. Because if you start having one of these conversations, this can come up, and you need to be ready for it. So you need to not be alarmist. If somebody starts talking about how they're depressed and they don't feel joy at anything anymore, do not jump to conclusions about it, okay? You need to get the facts, and you need to ask, are you safe? Are you considering this? Don't assume they're safe. Don't assume they're not safe. If you have a clear and unambiguous statement of intent, that's when you call for help. Because, unfortunately, depending on where you live, it can matter a ton when you do call for support. Because sometimes people with, weapons will show up, or people in positions of power And that can make a fraught situation a lot worse. Now, granted, that's a little better here in the UK than it is in the US. But it can still make a situation worse. So for instance, Jordan could be saying, hey, I might not know this, but I deal with some mood issues, and I really need some help just telling what emotions are real right now. That's a person in a critical moment asking for support. Now, ideally, again, Jordan is going to wait to ask for whatever they need, he's going to ask for whatever they need right now as specifically as possible, asking exactly what they need in that moment. And also ideally, if they need to leave, if they're hitting a moment where their anxiety or their pressures are just too much and they need to leave their situation, they can explain that. Ideally, Taylor is going to remain calm. When somebody comes up to you and they're experiencing strong emotions, our tendency is to mirror those emotions back at them. And so you need to avoid that. You need to take breaths and stay calm. And don't take someone's leaving as an insult. So we talked about asking. This is offering. Jordan offering future support to Taylor. We have an offering script like the other. Hey, I noticed that, behavioral observation here. Can we talk about it? Or do you think you could use action here? Can I help provide that for you? So for instance, Jordan could say, hey, Taylor, I noticed that when someone disagrees with you in a meeting, you stop talking and you shut down, even though you really care, obviously, about what you're talking about. Would you like me to help back you up when that happens? Now, ideally in that moment, Jordan is going to accept a no answer. Sometimes the person doesn't want that support or they just don't want it from you. And that's okay. And you should accept that answer. Jordan is going to try and keep their judgments and opinions out of it. Ideally, Taylor's only going to talk about their mental state if they want to. And they're going to provide clear guidance for what Jordan can do. Conversational type 2B is Taylor in a critical moment and Jordan offering support. So for instance, it seems like you're going through a rough moment. If you want, I can cover for you if you need to step out. Support can be that simple. Ideally, Jordan's going to keep their judgments and opinion out of it. And they're going to follow those safety guidelines unless they've prearranged a response with Taylor. If they've talked about it beforehand and said, hey, if you see me in this state, please do this for me. And ideally, Taylor's going to be honest about what they need, even if it's nothing. Sometimes there's just nothing you can do. And they also are hopefully going to assume that they're not a waste of Taylor's time, or Jordan's time, rather. Because that's the thing that the beast in your head starts telling you, is that you're not worthy of other people's help. You're not worthy of their efforts. And they should just go away and leave you alone. Conversation type 3 is explaining. Taylor explaining their experience to Jordan. So for instance, we have an explanation script. When an event happens, I sometimes, often, or always feel like insert feelings here. To cope or to deal with that, I insert behavior here. So Taylor could say, when I'm in a meeting and someone asks me a question, my brain freezes up. And all I can think about is what happens if I screw up and answer incorrectly. So to cope with that, I spend time before the meeting obsessing about all of the questions people could possibly ask me. So I don't tend to be very responsive on Slack or Teams or whatever. Well, ideally, Jordan is going to listen respectfully, and they aren't going to problem solve. And ideally in that moment, Taylor is going to avoid blaming or ranting. But they're also not going to be apologetic for their own feelings. Now, key to this scenario is this could be not okay with Jordan. Like, this behavior might not be all right. But Taylor's provided their experience in the world, and this is now a moment where Jordan can say, okay, given that, let's figure out what we can do from there. In that case, you're not problem solving for the other person, you're problem solving with them. Conversational type 4 is the check-in. Taylor checking in with Jordan. We have a check-in script, like you have the other scripts. You ready for this one? Because it's the hardest. Hey, how are you doing? The thing that we say to each other every morning can simply be more than just a hi. It can be an actual way to ask somebody, how are you doing? I live in the US Midwest, so a lot of the times you'll get people saying, I'm living the dream, which means that they are basically crying inside. But we don't have to let this just be the greeting. Taylor can just say, "Good morning, Jordan. How are you feeling today?" And Jordan can answer. Now, ideally, Jordan's going to answer with as much depth as they feel comfortable with. If Steve is asking you that question, you can just say, "I'm doing fine, Steve. Bye." Ideally, though, Taylor is also going to legitimately care for how Jordan is doing. If you ask that question and you don't really care, the other person can generally tell. The last conversation type is Jordan and Taylor talking like normal humans. So, for instance, Taylor could say, "Hello, fellow human. It's a good day to consume oxygen and carbon." Is it not, right? It is, since I'm also clearly a human. I enjoy these things as well as making pleasant conversations with my mouth parts. I'm joking, but what I'm getting at here is, after you started having conversations with people about their experiences, about what they're having in the world, about their mental health, not every conversation has to be about that from now on. If you're having a conversation, it can be about the weekend instead of like, "So how did your depression go this weekend?" "Well, it was great till now, thank you." Ideally, in this moment, remember, other people are humans. They all have varied interests and hobbies. And above all, throughout all of this, you need to remain compassionate, regardless of the side of the conversation you're on. Because it's hard sometimes to ask for help, and sometimes it's hard to offer help. So be compassionate and be kind. Okay, so what if you don't want to talk about your mental health, especially with Steve? Well, you don't have to. I'm hoping that I've made the case that it is important to do so, but you do not have to. You are the one in charge of whether you have these conversations or not. And if you're a manager or trying to introduce this to your team members are in charge of whether they have these conversations or not, whether they feel comfortable enough with you to have them. If they don't, I think that raises some questions about you as a manager that you should think about. But it is important, because if you do not trust your coworkers, do not do this. It's very important. So, we talked about language. So we can scratch that one off the list. Let's talk about fear, shame, and facile optimism. And talk about how to fight each of those in turn, all right? So let's talk about fighting facile optimism, which is a term that I made up because I couldn't find a good word for what I was describing. And what facile optimism is, it's this tendency we have to minimize our own experience in order to remain in control over it. This tendency to sit there and go, "No, I know, I have this going on and that going on, and my kid has the flu, and my dog is sick, but it's okay, I've got everything together." No, you probably don't. I have a coworker who was wandering around at one point, and I just kind of grabbed him, and I'm like, "Dude, are you okay? Because you just look frazzled, like, it's like the edges of you are fuzzy." And he's like, "Oh, man, I thought I was holding it together." And I'm like, "No." He's like, "Do you think my team can tell?" And I'm like, "Yes, they can absolutely tell." This is facile optimism, this tendency to go, "No, it'll be okay if I can just get through today, get through the next week, get through the next month. Just make it to tomorrow." We can fight that by having our conversations about these things before things get bad. Have the conversations about potential futures instead of in terms of current realities. This makes it easier for you later to continue that conversation. And frankly, everyone appreciates a heads up. Hey, this thing might happen to me in the future. You can also look to others. Other people can often see how this affects you more than you can, just like my coworker. So we get around that. How do we fight fear? Because fear is a major part of us not speaking up. And I'm asking you to do the hard thing in the moment that it is going to be the hardest for you. Well, I advise trying to prepare for it. Coming up and saying, okay, who am I going to talk to about it? When am I going to talk to them about it? Envision yourself actually doing the thing. If you actually envision the future, it's actually way more likely to happen. Not in a weird, like, secret way, but in the context of actually envisioning yourself taking an action that you can take, you're more likely to take that action when the time comes. Preparing for those moments can help you fight that fear in the moment. by making it easier for you to do the thing. Asking yourself, who are you going to tell if something happens? Is it going to be your boss? Is it going to be a coworker? Is it going to be your skip level? Who is actually going to listen? And can you work with them to set up a plan for how you'll tell them, something that they'll actually respond to, so you're not like sending a meeting on Friday at 5:30 and going, hey, can we talk about this on Tuesday? And they won't see it for the whole weekend. Or ask yourself, what habits can you form now that will help you if something happens? Whether that's having recurring check-ins with people, whether that's actually doing things like meditation, etc. You need to make the time and find the mental space to have that conversation, even if fear is gnawing on your heels. Because it's important, because it helps you and your team adapt to it. Regardless of, again, if it's something that's actually diagnosable or whether it's just something happening to you. So let's talk about fighting shame. Because I think this one is actually the most pernicious. So it's time for some art truth. If you use that, you owe me $5. That's how copyright works. I understand. No. I want to tell you something that is true, though. If you are struggling with your own experiences, whether it's diagnosed or not, you are not going to go psycho. You are not less than human. You are not incapable of functioning. And you are not worth less than other people. You are not less intelligent. And you are not dangerous. And you are not broken. And you are still capable of having human relationships. You are still capable of making decisions about your own life. You are still capable of participating in every part of that life. And you are still capable of logical, rational thought. It's okay to not be okay. You have nothing to be ashamed of. We don't hear that enough. But it's absolutely true. You should never be ashamed for what's happening inside of your own head. And even less for what's happening to you. But sometimes that's not enough, even for me, to remember that I don't have anything to be ashamed of. And I need to seek support from people I already trust. People who will tell me, it's okay. You don't have anything to be ashamed of, who will echo that back to me. Because I don't know about you, but sometimes I don't trust myself. Actually, most of the time, I don't think I trust myself, which is a strange thing if you think about it. But throughout the course of this talk, I guarantee that you've had a little voice in the back of your head shouting what ifs at you. Okay, well, Art's telling me to go talk about this stuff. What if I talk about this and this happens? What if this happens? What if this other thing happens? So let's run through some of those what ifs that you've probably thought up and talk about how to deal with them. What if nobody trusts you anymore at work, at home, wherever? Well, most of the time, and I'm not going to say it happens every time, but most of the time being honest and vulnerable actually improves trust between you and that other person. You're exposing part of yourself to them, and most people respond by turning around and saying, I understand that took effort. I understand you're being vulnerable. And they will often respond in kind. If it is true that somebody trusts you less, or you suspect that they trust you less because they're treating you different now, have this conversation. I feel like you no longer trust me. What can I do to regain your trust? You can actually just ask people those things. And if they turn around and they say nothing, or they say, no, it's fine, but they still keep treating you differently, then the hell with them. People like that don't deserve your time anyway. What if everybody treats you like you're fragile? Actually, the very first time I gave a talk about mental health, someone came up afterward and was talking about how not only did his wife not believe that mental illness was real, but his boss didn't believe that mental illness was real. And I'm like, oh. He'd been passed over for a promotion multiple times. I'm like, how do you square that when you don't believe it's real, but you also don't want to give this person a promotion? Sometimes, I've talked to other people since you've had that happen to them, and sometimes it happens from a good place. Good. People wanting to do the good thing. They don't want to stress you. They don't want to put things on you and make you feel worse. It's like, well, what do you think not giving a promotion for 5 years is? It's extremely stressful. You can help by showing other people where your own danger zones are, by pointing out to them what things are actually stressful to you and which things are going to be problematic. Because they don't know. They're not in your head. They're not you. And so if you point it out to them and say, this situation really drives me up the wall, this situation does not. My bosses now know that, well, thanks to my experience with the election company, and a couple negative experiences since, I don't want to work on data projects, like ETL projects anymore. They go very badly for me and my brain. And they know that. I've pointed that out to them. And so that we painted a line around it and said, okay, this is a no-go zone for art. Try to set up a communication plan to tell them when it gets to be too much. Plan ahead, make that decision so it will be easier in that moment. What if they don't believe you? And I'd like, oh, we just made that. I don't have an answer for that, folks. Like, if they turn around and you tell them, this is what's happening to me, this is what's occurring in my head, and they just say, well, I don't believe you. That's kind of a non-starter. It's really difficult to progress from there. The only possible answer you have at that point is find other allies and dig in your heels and get ready for a fight. Because it's going to be an uphill battle. Alternately, you can try to get out of wherever that is as soon as you can. It's not always possible, I understand that. But in that situation where somebody doesn't believe the words that are coming out of your mouth, that's an extremely stressful situation and an extremely negative one that you might want to rethink being in. What if you get bullied? What if you get fired because of it? Well, you do have to use your best judgment here. Like I said earlier, if you don't feel safe, if you don't trust your coworker, don't do this. And you're the only one who can make the call whether it's safe or not. Additionally, you are relying on your company's HR department to be in your corner. And unfortunately for you, they're not. They are in your company's corner. They may tell you that they are in your corner. When push comes to shove, they're absolutely going to cover your company over you. Them's the breaks, sorry. Point is that you have to be careful about it. One of the things that I recommend is trial balloons. Try telling people something relatively safe, relatively innocuous. You know, you had a migraine all weekend and you didn't sleep well, and so you're just not great today. That's an experience most people can somewhat relate to. And you float that out there, and you watch, and to see if that circles back to you from another place. Or you watch to see how they respond to it. And that can start to tell you, is this going to be a safe environment? If it is, maybe you release a little more next time, and you float it out there. So, let's talk about what you can actually do tomorrow. What you can take from this, well, probably not tomorrow, but when first day back at work. What you can take and actually implement. Ask yourself, is there anything happening right now, anything big? Or is there anything big that's likely to happen in your near future? And that can be positive as well as negative. I mean, it could be something like an upcoming wedding that you're having. Turns out that's going to put, if you're in the wedding, it's going to take up a significant chunk of your brain space. I mean, I hope. Let's put it that way. Planning about it and realizing this thing is going to occur. I need to tell somebody this thing is going to occur. I need to let them know that this is likely to affect me. And setting up your plans for if and when something happens. preparing, laying those things down so that facile optimism or fear doesn't stop you in that moment. Start listening closely to your team to see if it's safe to share, listening to what they're saying about other people. Are they talking about people behind their backs? It's probably not a super safe environment. Bring up the idea of actually sharing feelings with your team. In a work context, things like, how did you feel about this last release? Which sounds like an Eliza question from 1970s, but it's an honest question you can ask. Like, did you feel this was okay? How many people have ever done like the fist of 5 in sprint planning or something? Nobody? Wow. Okay. I envy all of you. There's a technique where they do in sprint planning sometimes where it's a fist of 5. It's like, how confident are you that we can actually get all of this done? And you have to hold up like 1 to 5 fingers, or 1 to 5 fingers if you're German. And it's phenomenally Baroque, and it's all because we believe that we can't ask other people, like, how do you actually feel as a human being? Asking somebody, how do you feel about this outage that we just had? How do you feel about this thing in a postmortem, in a retrospective? You can do that. You can just have those conversations. And if you start doing that, you can then have deeper conversations about what's going on in your life and your coworkers' lives. So, all right, let's wrap up here. I want you to believe that your thoughts and your emotions affect your work. You cannot leave those things at the door. It just doesn't work that way, sorry. Trust me, everything would be so much easier if it did. What's that show, Severance? Has anybody watched that? I don't have Apple stuff, so I've not gotten around to it, but everybody's like, yeah, you should watch that because it's exactly what you talk about. I'm like, that sounds like the opposite of what I talk about, but okay. I want you to believe that being able to discuss your experience with your coworkers is important to your team's resilience. Being able to account for what is happening in your life, like me with my cat. I mean, and that's a literal, like, I was dumber, literally dumber, and still am, frankly, than I was a couple months ago because the emotions affected me that much. And so it's important to know, because otherwise they're going to, dump all of those points in the sprint. They're going to say, well, we can get this much done. It's like, no, you can't, because it's about a half to a quarter of an actual arc. You can enable those discussions by using that experiential language that we talked about, by being descriptive, not prescriptive, by being compassionate with other people, being kind, and by recognizing that just because you know what it's like for one person doesn't mean you know what it's like for everyone. You can avoid facile optimism by developing plans beforehand. And you are stronger than your own fear. You have to own your experience because you have nothing to be ashamed of. You don't need to go through the workday carrying that load alone. Thank you very much for listening. We have a couple minutes left for questions if anybody had any. I understand this is a very personal topic, so I'll be up here if you have any questions. If nobody has any questions now, I'll be up here, and then you can catch me through the rest of the conference. So, anybody? Nope. All right, thank you.